Welcome to Zero. I'm Akshat Rathi. This week, the Electrotech Revolution. Here's a crazy stat for you. If you're driving a fossil fuel car, gasoline, diesel, whatever, more than 70% of the energy you put into the car is wasted as heat. Only 30% actually moves the car. And that's after more than a century of phenomenal effort to make the internal combustion engine as efficient as possible. By comparison, if you're driving an electric car, more than 80% of the energy moves the car. And that's of course now when the electric car story is just beginning. This kind of enormous efficiency gain that comes from stopping burning molecules and powering things with electrons is one of the key pillars of what my guest today, Kingsmill Bond, calls the Electrotech Revolution. This, he believes, is a moment in time where electricity-related technologies start to challenge the dominance of fossil fuels. Kingsmill is a strategist at the think tank Ember and has had a long career working across finance for Deutsche Bank and Citibank, as well as a strategist for non-profits like Carbon Tracker and the Rocky Mountain Institute. Alongside his colleagues at Ember, he published a report late last year full of cool statistics showing how that revolution is unfolding, which countries are speeding ahead and which are falling behind. With countries like the US backsliding on Electrotech, I wanted to invite Kingsmill to talk about why he is so certain that the Electrotech revolution is inevitable and what happens to those that are left behind. Kingsmill, welcome to Zero.
Hi, Akshat. Nice to see you.
Let's start with what you've been currently obsessed with. Your team calls it the Electrotech Revolution. What is it?
So the Electrotech Revolution is simply a name that we've given to a series of technologies which are rapidly upending the energy sector. And in broad terms, those technologies can be classified in three different parts. You have supply, demand, and connections. So supply is the very rapid growth of solar and wind. Demand is the rapid growth of electric vehicles and other electrification technologies. And connections is possibly the least appreciated but the most interesting part. And it's all of the connections in the middle. So it's batteries and it's smart grids and it's software and it's this rising idea of an energy net. And it's all the technologies which connect the supply and demand of electrons.
Including artificial intelligence.
Including AI. And I think it's very interesting that AI is very clearly a tool of electrification and it's part of the electrification story.
Why do you call it a revolution? Why is that the term to use right now?
Because it is so rapid and it's so disruptive. And that's the difference, I suggest, between revolution and evolution. So evolution would be slow and gentle and nobody would get hurt. Revolution means that you move from growing Chinese oil demand to declining oil demand in a single year. And then people who have planned for the old system to continue get damaged.
Right. So the first 100 years of electricity were an evolution, but now it becomes the thing because of all these technology sets from solar panels and wind turbines and electric motors and batteries and heat pumps. They're all converging to a point where their use is so easy that you can have a revolutionary change.
Yes, you put it much more elegantly than I did, actually. So it is indeed the coming together of these technologies. You know, after decades of evolution, when they come together, they create revolutionary force, and it's possibly to overstate. Then the same thing as that's how you get perfect storms, when lots of different weather fronts come together at the right place at the right time. That's what's now happening in the energy system as we finally, after decades, actually have figured out how to deploy these technologies at speed and scale.
So I want to slice and dice this in different ways, but let's start with something that I got asked a lot last year. So we did this series called Bottlenecks, where we published a bunch of features on Bloomberg and had conversations here on this podcast. And the main thesis was that even as Western countries are now seeing a real boom in electricity demand, and that's like first time in decades, They are struggling to build all that electricity supply because of bottlenecks of things that people don't think about. So stuff like transformers and cables, but also skilled workers and engineers. And that's holding back electrification. One question that we got in response to that series is, wait, you're a climate journalist. Why is this a climate story?
There are two parts to the energy transition. People often forget this. So the first part is the decarbonization of electricity generation, where we have solar and wind. And it's worthwhile saying, for example, that all of the growth in electricity demand now comes from solar and wind. So every single new electron added to the system on a system basis is clean. But then the second part of the energy transition, and the one that's most frequently forgotten, particularly in the West actually, is electrification. You have to electrify everything. So you need to do both of these things if you wish to push out fossil fuels. But it's not just, as you know, Akshat, not just a question anymore of pushing out fossil fuels. It's a question of getting economic and geopolitical advantage.
But in this case, a lot of the electricity demand in Western countries is being driven by data centers. And a lot of those data centers are taking whatever electrons they can get, whether that comes from fossil fuels or not. Or in fact, they're building a lot more gas supply. So even a system-wide electrification is driving the reduction in fossil fuel use for the first time now. There are these pockets where just this massive growth in electricity is being driven by fossil fuels. Why then is still electrification a climate story?
First of all, you need to distinguish between an individual actor and the system, obviously. And then secondly, you have a need to electrify everything. And if you have a small amount of fossil fuels going into your electricity generation, which then replaces fossil fuels, then on a net basis, you are reducing your fossil fuel demand. So, but in concrete terms, in Europe at the moment, 70% of our electricity generation is from non-fossil sources, but 80% of what we're trying to electrify is from fossil fuels. So by definition, every time you add electricity to the system, it is pushing a more fossil-intensive source out. So it is a far superior solution.
And then there is the efficiency story that comes with electrification. So there's this really nice phrase that I've heard you talk about, which is electrons are disciplined and molecules are fiery.
This is Marie Lovin's phrase, of course, yes.
And that leads to energy outcomes that are very interesting. So what is it about electrification and efficiency that makes it a driver of change?
So when you're talking about electrification, it's quite interesting. There are two areas. If I take the Nick Air framing, you can actually divide all useful energy into two parts, heat and work. And whenever electricity is replacing molecules in work solutions, which in English means transport, above all, then you have a 3 or 4 to 1 efficiency advantage. When they're replacing molecules in heat, they have that advantage if they use heat pumps. But the really interesting story is when electricity replaces fossil molecules in transport, we have a 3 to 1 efficiency advantage. And then also further up the chain, when solar replaces coal or gas in the generation of electricity, you also have a 3 to 1 efficiency advantage. So on a net basis, the system we currently have uses about 600 exajoules of primary energy to get 200 exajoules of useful energy. If you were to decarbonize electricity generation and electrify, it would be about 200 to 200. So you have a massive reduction in primary energy demand, which just makes everything considerably easier.
Yeah, it is surprising. Most people don't know that the internal combustion engine in a car is essentially wasting 75% of all the energy just as waste heat and not turning it into transport, whereas an electric car is 80-90% efficient, even if you count for the electricity coming to you via this transmission system, that there are some losses. If that's the case, that there are all these advantages that electricity and the electricity system has for people, for economies, for the climate problem, for bills, why is it that electricity and Electrotech Revolution doesn't sell itself?
To a degree, the answer to that is that we are now selling it, Akshat. And it's not, of course, just us. There are many other people who have many different parts of the system which they are deploying. And I think to answer your question, In the first part of the Electrotech Revolution, the deployment of renewables, as you know, solar's been doubling every 3 years and wind's been growing also very rapidly. So actually, on the decarbonization of electricity, it's pretty much job done. Now, all of the growth is now coming from Ember statistics. From 2025, all of the growth came from solar and wind. So we've reached the peak, increasingly clear in China, and we're on the other side. But that's only, as I say, one piece of the system. It's about 20% of final energy demand. The really exciting story, and the story of 2026 onward, is electrification and increasing the speed with which electricity can replace molecules in the system. And that's not been happening nearly as quickly. That's only been growing at 3 or 4% a year and needs to happen quicker.
Now we have the second largest consumer of energy, the United States, a government that isn't particularly interested in either electrification or in clean energy. And the Energy Secretary, Chris Wright, is talking about this all the time. One of the most recent things he said is, look, wherever clean electricity has taken off, it has led to higher electricity prices and to, as a result, deindustrialization. Germany is a classic case in that, but you could count the UK in it as well. Do you think higher electricity prices are just a feature of Electrotech, or are there other ways to deal with this issue?
Well, as you know, it is a pretty complicated issue. So one of the very obvious pushbacks to this framing that decarbonisation increases electricity prices, the counter-argument is China, which of course has amongst the world's cheapest prices for electricity and has very rapidly been deploying solar and wind. And the answer basically is, if you do it right, you can get your prices down. If you do it wrong, then your prices don't fall. And there's a huge amount of policy improvement and policy learning that needs to be taken from successful countries and deployed in other countries in order to get electricity prices down. I think this is one of the big things actually now that people are starting to think about in the UK is being talked about increasingly in Europe. How do we use these cheap renewable sources not merely to decarbonize but also to get costs down?
What did Europe get wrong then?
One of the errors that's been made is a failure to recognize that electrification is the core and second vector of change. And therefore, people have loaded costs onto electricity generation. So right now in Europe, as an example, electricity is being taxed at 2 or 3 times the level of taxation on gas. Now, if we're right and we need to electrify and we need to encourage electricity to push gas out of the system, obviously that needs to be reversed. And there are some countries, notably Sweden, where they don't do that. And Denmark, of course, has just famously taken the tax off electricity. So one area is we need to reduce the costs being loaded onto electricity. A second thing we need to do is just need to make it considerably easier to electrify. So all these historic rules and structures that we have, which bolster the old system, we need to rewrite them. There's a lot of work then to be done in that area. The third thing is that we need to stop pouring in money into ersatz fake 2050 solutions such as carbon capture and other very high cost solutions. Let's take all of that money and put it into reducing electricity prices and then let the market do the work.
One thing you highlight in your Electrotech Revolution thesis is that because of these forces, the Electrotech Revolution is inevitable because the physics drives it, the efficiency drives it, and if you have the right policies, the cost will also start to drive it. If that is the case, then why are we here in 2026 where the US is going after Venezuelan oil and there is this worldview being created among the Canadians, among the Australians that the fossil fuel system still has plenty of legs and one that we must pursue?
So as one of your previous interlocutors, Sheldon Whitehouse, pointed out, if the fossil fuel industry is able to take over a government, then they will support policies which favour the fossil fuel industry. Really, it's as simple as that. And we shouldn't be surprised that incumbents are mounting a massive fight back and resisting changes as powerfully as they can, because obviously this new technology shift, as with other technology shifts, will wipe them out eventually. And of course, therefore, if they can buy themselves another 5 or 10 years, that's what they're doing. But it doesn't really detract from the fundamental drivers, as you say, of of physics, efficiency, of economics, and now increasingly of geopolitics. And I think this is another angle which is becoming increasingly apparent, or became increasingly apparent in 2025. The more that petrostate power is exercised aggressively around the world, and Venezuela is another good example of this, the more that people will be scared to become dependent upon imported fossil fuels and will hunt for their own domestic resources. And that's what Electrotech can deliver. So if you decarbonize electricity and electrify in demand, then you're getting your own sunshine and your own wind and your own talent building the electricity system, and it's all homegrown.
And one of the things that you've done throughout your career, whether that was at Carbon Tracker or Rocky Mountain Institute or now at Ember, is that you've tried to not just make this narrative point, but actually throw numbers underneath it, which show this in 100 different ways. There are 100 slides in the Electrotech Revolution deck. But on the opposite side, you also get numbers thrown around. So one that Chris Wright tries to bring up again and again, he's like, look, if you look at the total amount of energy consumed in 1970s, 85% came from fossil fuels. You look at the number today, 80% comes from fossil fuels. What even has clean tech done for the world? How do you answer that?
Well, first of all, actually, just numerically, this is you have to be quite cute with the numbers, because it's gone from 95 to 80 over about 40 years. So it has been falling, the share of fossil fuels. But actually, there's a much more fundamental...
And that's in primary energy.
There's a much more fundamental response to this, which is you're looking at the wrong numbers, folks. So to give a good analogy, perhaps, when you look at bread demand, do you count the wheat harvest? No, you look at final demand, bread demand. When you look at the car industry and you're trying to figure out whether Tesla or BYD or Toyota is a better bet for the future, do you look at the number of Toyotas in the streets? No, you look at the market share of sales. So there are two errors which are being made by incumbents. The first is they are looking at primary, not useful. They're looking from the supplier perspective, not the consumer's perspective. And then the second is they're looking at stock, not flow. And when you flip it around and look at the amount of useful energy which is pouring into the system from renewable sources in the electricity sector, solar and wind are 100% of the growth. In final demand, electricity is about 50 to 60% of the growth. So there's a huge shift going on. And again, as a kind of finance person, it's worthwhile standing back and saying, of course, there are, any legacy industry will always be dominant as a share of the total at the top. But that's not what you want to look at. You want to look at the share of change, or even the change of change.
One place where you have this new report out where you can see the change is in India. And, I come from India. I've always thought that given the size of the country, given its state of development right now, where the Indian energy transition goes is where the rest of the world's energy transition will go. What did you learn from doing this work? What does the report conclude?
So we're extremely excited about this analysis that we're just putting out, because there is this conventional orthodox narrative that India and the emerging markets must follow the same path that the West and China did, and they must go from biomass to fossil fuels, and that's their path to greater energy demand. And you see that in the pages of the Exxon forecasts and in the implicit assumptions of the EIA, for example. What we're finding is that India specifically, as an illustration of what's happening in other emerging markets, but India's taking a new path. And India is taking its own path to an electrotech future. And in very simple terms, rather than going from biomass to electrons as your primary final energy source via fossil fuels, they're avoiding the fossil detour. They're going straight to electrons. And it's very interesting. And there's a very interesting, there's a kind of ternary chart we'd produce in our analysis, which shows that Europe and the US 50 years ago went down the fossil path and now are coming back towards the electric solution. China also started cascading down the fossil path 25 years ago and now is coming back to the electric solution. India, cleverly, is going straight there. So to compare, if you compare and contrast the situation in India today with the situation in China when it had a similar level of GDP per capita, which is around 2012 in PPP terms, you see that India just got a whole suite of new solutions available to it. So it's got very cheap solar. It's got so solar plus batteries now $40 per megawatt hour. It's got very cheap batteries available to it, and therefore India is getting 7% of its electricity from solar today, where China has 0 at a similar level of GDP per capita. And it's got 19% electrification, which is almost the same level as the United States, even though its GDP per capita is dramatically lower. And EV market share is 5% and 65% or 60% in three-wheelers. So India's just doing a lot of very, very different stuff to what other countries did at a similar level of GDP per capita. And as a result of that, India's fossil fuel demand is dramatically lower than that of China specifically at a similar level of GDP per capita. And to give you the stats, Indian demand for coal is around 1 megawatt hour per person, where China was 2.5. And it is looking, and as you know, this year, Indian coal demand per capita fell. It's looking increasingly like Indian coal demand per capita is never going down the old China route. And the same story with petrol, where Indian demand for petrol per capita is around 100 litres, where China was 250. And India's not going down this other path, it's taking its own path.
So this is where you're flipping the stock and flow story here, because most of the time you talk about India and you say, oh, look, they are building all this solar. They're like, but look, they're also building all these coal power plants, which is the flow part. There are, yes, in plan currently, lots of new coal power plants that are going to still come. But what you're saying is, yes, they may build more coal power plants, but as a total proportion, at their level of wealth, they're actually a much cleaner country already.
We're not flipping the stock and flow part, because if you look at the flow story, 75% of the growth in 2025 in electricity generation came from solar. So the particular argument that you're talking about India building new coal-fired capacity, the key point here is that you don't want to look at the capacity of coal, you want to look at how much coal is burnt. And what's happening is that coal is shifting from baseload to backup, and these facilities are moving from operating at 80, 90% to operating at 20, 30%. And as you know, China's gone through 50%. India's now heading, I believe, towards 50% capacity utilization in its coal sector. So people need to understand where the electricity is being generated from. And actually, from a flow perspective, as I say, it's increasingly from solar now. Again, it's not entirely surprising. I mean, it's the same thing with all technologies. When you had the mobile phone revolution, did you want to put all the money into building fixed line phone systems? No, you didn't. Now you've got all this Electrotech. Why bother with the old fossil tech when the new stuff is cheaper and cleaner and faster and local? And of course, India specifically and many other emerging markets has a massive fossil fuel dependency problem. Almost all of India's oil and gas is imported, and actually quite a large chunk of its coal as well. And therefore, for India both to grow and have energy independence and to reduce the terrible burden of $150 billion of fossil fuel imports, 5% of GDP every year, India needs to find other solutions. And of course, they're doing that because they can.
After the break, I asked Kingsmill what would derail the Electrotech revolution. And if you're enjoying this episode, please take a moment to rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. We love reading your feedback, and it helps new listeners discover Zero. Recently, Felicity Future wrote, I really like the moderator, and the Argentina episode was super interesting. Thank you, Felicity. I kind of like the moderator too. Now be the devil's advocate and tell me what derails the Electrotech revolution.
So what derails the Electrotech revolution would be if China suddenly found a huge oil deposit and a very cheap one, and then decided that they didn't need these technologies. That would be one thing which could certainly not necessarily derail, but hold it back for a while. I guess a lot of people have pointed to the rising conflict between China and the United States as something that's going to hold back change. But in fact, what's actually happening on the ground is it's speeding up change, because now China has an incentive to deploy their technologies, possibly to allow their technologies to be deployed more rapidly in the emerging markets. And at the same time, people are getting nervous about the amount of petrostate power being exercised by Trump and his coterie, and therefore are hunting for domestic solutions. So actually, strangely enough, that tension is I would suggest, speeding up change.
You guys have also talked about this idea of an electrostate, that countries like China, like India, are now going down the path where their development is coming through electricity, where their economic story will come through electricity. Define electrostate.
An electrostate, as we define it, is simply a country which is getting its electricity from renewable sources and its final energy from electricity. So, of course, nobody's got 100% and 100%, but increasingly countries are gravitating to getting their electricity from renewable sources and their final energy from electricity. So that's how we define it. And there's one further, I'd be lax if I didn't mention one further angle to this, which is using your electrostate advantages to deploy power as an electro-power. The point is that anyone, I would suggest, can become an electrostate. Very few countries can exercise power, because that's the difference between electricity and fossil fuels. Fossil fuels enable you to have power over others. Electrostate technologies allow you to have power over yourself.
Oh, that's an interesting way of thinking about it, because most people in the energy space understand what a petrostate is, which is, first being that most of its income comes from petroleum in some form, and that they use that income to drive power and drive geopolitical tensions around the world. So in that sense, America wouldn't fall in the classic category of a petrostate, because its economy is not hugely dependent on fossil fuels. And yet it does fall in the definition of a petrostate these days, with using its geopolitical power as the world's largest producer of oil and gas. If you flip it, China is starting to use some of its electrostate power for actual geopolitical power, right? It's going to all these developing countries where it is deploying electrification resources, whether that is in the grid itself, which it's doing in plenty of places, or whether it's supplying electric cars. But electrostate itself doesn't lead to an automatic state of power, whereas petrostate does.
Yes, exactly. And I think that's the grey difference between this new world we're entering into, which is not so Darwinian, not so Hobbesian, shall we say. It is giving people much more local distributed power. So when it comes to this argument, I very frequently hear from my friends in the fossil fuel industry that Europe, for example, should worry about being dependent upon China for electrostate imports, and that there is an equivalence between Electrotech imports and fossil fuel imports. This clearly is incorrect. And the main reason it's incorrect is because you're, again, confusing stocks and flows. So if you buy a solar panel, it lasts for 30 years. Your solar panel supplier cuts you off. You've got 30 years to find another one. If you buy a barrel of oil, you have to burn it the same day, and then the next day you have to buy another one. So it's just completely different, your degree of dependency. That's one angle. And if I may, there's one other, I think, very important point here, which is that in the old world of fossil fuel dominance, a very small number of countries, by geographic chance, is sitting on a very large share of the energy resources. In the Electrotech world, anyone can do it. And it's not just the fact that everyone's got sunshine and wind, but everybody can build, if they want to, Electrotech systems. And it's very interesting. Everyone talks all the time about how China dominates solar panel and battery production. And that is true, but there are plenty of other pieces in the Electrotech system. So cables, for example, and software and transformers. And there are plenty of other countries, actually, who are rising, already supplying this. And I would suggest we're probably at a moment of peak Chinese dominance in the Electrotech system. And as the rest of the world starts to wake up and realize that this is the energy future, and India is a classic example of this, we will actually see that dominance fall.
But we are seeing very interesting things play out as a result. So India, yes, you're right that it is trying to build its own supply chain for all sorts of Electrotech. But just this past week, we've heard from Reliance, which was trying to build its own lithium-ion battery supply, that it has halted that project because the Chinese wouldn't provide the equipment that is necessary, which the Chinese make to make the batteries in India. We've also seen, for example, in the Net Zero Industry Act in the European Union, which is asking its member states to start to reduce Chinese dependence on all sorts of electrotech. Italy is the first country that has come out with a rule that is requiring a pretty strict definition of what Chinese contribution to its solar industry counts as. And as a result, it can only now access 10% of the solar modules that are produced in the world, which is still plenty. Italy is a small country, it'll get its supply. But imagine if all of Europe has to suddenly do that. There is a risk that the Chinese dominance in electrotech starts to actually not be an advantage for the world in the future, as it has been so far, because it's been cheap to get that stuff.
Yeah, it's a really good point that if nothing changes, then it will be dangerous. And this, I guess, is why things do need to change. And actually, in fairness, do need to continue to change. Because, again, there are these very famous statistics being produced by a number of people showing that the Chinese investment abroad in building electrotech facilities is now $200 billion, which is at a level comparable to the Marshall Plan. And there are now facilities being built all over the world, from Europe to India to Southeast Asia to South America, which we need to be careful about this. Obviously, it needs to be done in a good way. It needs to be done in a way that allows the technology expertise to be transferred over time. And as you say, Akshat, it's not guaranteed that will happen. And that's the function of governments, to seek to ensure that they get these technologies effectively. But I think if I may push back on one other point, take India, for example. India in the last decade has gone from having around $22 billion of electronics production to $130 billion. So fivefold increase. It's gone from making 2 million phones to 300 million phones. So clearly there's a huge amount of talent and capacity, and there are bound to be teething troubles. But I think when you're kind of looking at the direction of travel and an increasingly clear recognition in the emerging markets that this is the future, people will build these facilities.
Beyond economics and even geopolitics, one place where at a government level everything is trumped is national security. And what we've seen is that the electrical system, like any energy system, has real challenges when it comes to being resilient in the face of, say, cyber attacks. So famously this year, when the capture of Maduro happened in Venezuela, the Venezuelan power grid was disabled by the US. These kinds of cyber risks are real. In a digital world, they happen in all sorts of places, but the grid itself, the more central it becomes to running a country, which it already is in most countries, but if we are looking at this electrification pathway, it really becomes the source of energy. How do you think of the Electrotech Revolution in the face of a resiliency and a security problem?
So I guess the first point to be made is this is not new. We've had cyber attacks on our electricity system for decades.
Also on the fossil fuel system, because the gas pipeline in the US, if you remember, during the pandemic was famously under cyber attack. We still don't know who exactly caused it, but there was an issue with fossil fuel transport as well.
Exactly. And all of our systems come under attack at different moments. And the part of the answer is we need to deploy the resources as countries, or many countries, are doing in order to ensure that we have greater resilience. But if I extrapolate your argument to its absolutely logical conclusion, we should kind of all be using stones, because that can't be hacked. I mean, ultimately, if we wish to have a modern society, we have to deploy very powerful cybernetic security. But there's actually one very interesting new idea which is now materializing from Sweden, from Jonas Bergersen, who has come up with an energy net system, which is now being deployed in Lund and is possibly going to get rolled out in Sweden. And then in the same way as broadband internet protocol spread globally, this energy protocol could also spread globally. And this energy protocol is much more resilient because it's all local systems. Each one is separated from the wider grid. Galvanized, I think, is the technical term, from the wider grid, and therefore you can't cause cascading blackouts in the entire grid if you hack one little piece of the system. And again, I merely mention this as one of the very interesting new ideas which is bubbling up from entrepreneurs such as Bigerson in order to help to solve the problem.
Why is this story much harder and much slower in a way, right? This happened most recently in the telecom industry, where you went from, dial-up internet to fiber internet, or you went from telephones on your desk to mobile phones, and a bunch of companies lost as a result. Are you saying this is harder because the incumbent industry is just so much larger, has so much more political influence than any other industry that was kicked out as a result of technology change?
Yeah, but I think you put your finger on it. That's the point. I mean, the energy system generates $2,000 billion of rent every single year. Rent's the difference between how much it costs you to extract the oil and how much you get paid for it. And that's an awfully large amount of money that you can use to try and slow down change. And what actually is even more interesting is, in spite of all that money, in spite of the constant cascade of lies trying to prop up the status quo, change is just ongoing. It's so powerful.
One aspect that we haven't touched on in the Electrotech Revolution is the idea of sectors that have not yet been electrified. So, batteries are doing a lot to try and make the grid become more and more clean as a result. But what about industry? Because there's all these hard-to-abate sectors, as they are called: steel, cement, aviation, shipping. How is the Electrotech Revolution going to come to them?
So it's not a relevant question in 2026, not to dismiss it in any way, but let me give you a couple of analogies. I mean, the first one would be, I'm sure, Akshat, you were very good at maths at school. You went through school, no doubt, shining, and you had your initial exams, and you eventually get to your university finals in maths. And we don't ask 7-year-olds to take university finals in maths, right? We first of all teach them algebra. And it's exactly the same in the energy transition. We don't need to be doing the really hard stuff at scale everywhere today. We need to do the easy stuff, the easy to solve sectors. And the great lesson of the last decade is the more you solve the easy to solve sectors, the wider the solution suite, the cheaper the Electrotech solutions, and the more opportunities arise to solve the harder ones. So we've actually, if I may say so, we have made a bit of a category error by focusing so hard on the hard-to-solve sectors in 2026, or for the last decade, actually. We definitely need to do that. So I'm not suggesting for a second that the people doing this hard and brilliant work to decarbonize the hardest-to-solve sectors shouldn't be doing it. Of course they should be doing it, and I salute them. But from a system perspective, what we need to be doing is we need to be removing the barriers to entry in order to speed up deployment of solar and wind and speed up electrification. And actually, if I may sort of conclude on this, one of the reasons why it's been so hard to electrify end use in Europe, so Europe's been stuck at around 22% for about 15 years. One of the reasons why is because we've had these people trying to figure out 2050 solutions and building hydrogen highways through Germany and coming up with totally mad ideas like bioenergy, carbon capture and storage for 2050, and thinking about pouring this stuff into the earth. These are all completely irrelevant in 2026. But what they're doing is they're loading costs onto the old system. They're confusing the public. They're slowing down change, and they're stopping us from doing what we need to do, which is get the electricity price down and just electrify stuff.
I'm not sure on the policy side. I quite agree. On the narrative side, maybe true. But, for Europe to have essentially brought in renewables policy in the early 2000s and pour hundreds of billions of euros through Germany, through Spain, is what allowed solar to become this cheap because the Chinese were supplying it, etc. And so you need to do that for the 2050 technologies now. But I think I agree with you that the narrative side, perhaps the fact that we talk about, but what about this stuff that hasn't been solved, as a way of distracting from the real advantages that the technology has brought, is probably real.
Yeah, but just to push back a little bit on this, I mean, ultimately what has worked has been small modular technologies, and not everything has worked. And if there's been a great lesson, as Doan Farmer at Oxford points out, it's really been, if you lent into small modular technologies, you could replicate at scale, and that's where we've had a lot of success. So our very simple observation is solar and wind and power electronics and electrification, AI and software, and these are all classic technologies where the costs are falling over time. We should lean into them and hunt for solutions there. That will then create a foundation on which our children can actually figure out the hard-to-solve sectors eventually.
Thank you, Kingsmill.
Thank you, Akshat.
And thank you for listening to Zero. Now for the sound of the week. The louder one was the sound of a mechanical shutter on a mirrorless digital camera, while the quieter one was the electronic shutter on the same camera. I recently bought a new mirrorless digital camera with film simulations and have been nerding out about how so much of the camera is still quite analog and old school. If you liked this episode, please take a moment to rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and Spotify. This episode was produced by Oscar Boyd. Our theme music is composed by Wonderly. Special thanks to Samar Sadi, Moses Andam, Laura Milan, and Sharon Chen. I am Akshat Rathi, back soon.